I began my tenure with no misapprehensions, no misunderstandings about the severity of the challenges that our community faces, whether economically, socially, environmentally, and financially. The trust to build resilience against the existential threat of climate change in all its dimensions, and the urgency of constructing a recovery from the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has demanded focused energy. With respect to COVID-19, the primary focus so far has been on acquiring sufficient vaccines to save lives and provide protection to allow for the revival of economic activity. With the assistance primarily of the governments of India, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, as well as our provisions under the COVAX facility and the highly appreciated accommodation of the African Union through the African Medical Supplies Platform, a significant supply of vaccines have been made available across member states. Our heads of government, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPHA, and the Caricom Secretariat continue to work tirelessly to maintain an adequate flow of supply. However, we have not been as successful in persuading sufficient of our citizens to be vaccinated so as to reduce the rate of death and the severity of infections, as well as the stress on our health systems and our frontline personnel. With regard to climate change, our community was deeply involved in the run-up to and the negotiations at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. The outcome fell short of our expectations, and much work needs to be done as we continue to advocate on two levels. The first is to advocate for action to reduce CO2 emissions to a level that will keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The second is to advocate for access to adequate and affordable resources to address the impact of climate change, which we are already experiencing. We are among the least of the offenders, but we bear the greatest burden of the impact of climate change. With regard to Haiti, we continue to monitor closely the ongoing situation in our member state. The community has offered to facilitate a process of national dialogue and negotiation to help the Haitian people and their institutions to craft an indigenous solution to the crisis. With regard to the CSME, in agriculture, the Special Ministerial Task Force on Food Production and Food Security has been working closely with the private sector on an action plan to follow up and monitor implementation of the strategy put forward by the President of Guyana, who is the head responsible for the agricultural sector in our quasi-cabinet, in a document entitled Advancing the Caricom Food Systems Agenda, Prioritizing Regional Food and Nutrition Security. We look forward to receiving a comprehensive plan from the Caricom private sector organization for investment in the sector. We have also agreed on a program of support measures for industries and firms in the OECS and Belize to make them more competitive within the CSME. This is in keeping with treaty provisions which aim to make the benefits and opportunities of the CSME more equitable. With regard to external relations, we had a very successful summit earlier this year with the African Union, with a work program for the Caricom Secretariat and the African Union Commission to follow up, which will This will facilitate collaboration across the secretariats, even as bilateral relations between African and Caribbean countries continue to strengthen. In 2022, we expect that pandemic-related issues will continue to dominate, with implications for our economies and for the social sector. The situation in Haiti will also continue to engage our priority attention. We expect these issues to arise at the forefront of our 33rd intersessional meeting of the heads, which will take place on the 28th of February and 1st of March, with Belize as the host. So I finish my few remarks there, and I open the floor for conversation. Thank you.
How much of a hit has the Caricom agenda sustained throughout this pandemic? And another angle on that, I suppose, would be, what are your feelings on the failure so far to have a joint approach that closely resembles the earlier plans to have a Caricom bubble in the midst of the pandemic?
The truth is that the hit to the region has been widespread. The hit has been very much at the national levels as well, where we've had the economies, particularly the tourism-focused economies, bear a huge burden as soon as travel to the region ceased around May of last year. In terms of the Caricom agenda, what the pandemic has done is it has forced us to collaborate much more closely on a number of things. First, of course, being access to vaccines. And so we've been able to negotiate together to access vaccines for our member states reasonably successfully, and in a way that made sense for us, because none of us individually would have been able to enter. It would not have made sense for us to try to do it as individual territories. So the pandemic has forced us to work together on that very important issue of access to vaccines. And it's also raised the level of priority that we now have to give to a number of things, which we have been talking about for some time. And now we are all trying to get these things done individually and at the Caricom level. We're talking about things like incorporating IT more into the way we work. So we have a lot of e-governance programs, accelerating at the level of member states, and within the Secretariat as well. We're having to work through how we work differently because of having to integrate ICTs more into the way we communicate, work, get our business done. It also has put greater emphasis on agriculture, because one of the things that happened early in the pandemic is that the shipping lanes were disrupted. And I say this often, for a region with a $5 billion food import bill, when we have the capacity to produce food and therefore provide some degree of food security, we needed to prioritize that. And so this has put much greater impact for us on agriculture development, particularly the production of food, to ensure food security. It's also given us greater priority to institutions like CARPA and SEDIMA, that we've known have been important in the past, but now we know that they have to be properly organized, supported, and enabled to work. And so that has been happening with those agencies as well. So there's a plus and there's a minus. We've had a huge hit, but we've also had the opportunity in many ways to reconsider where we are and how best to change what we do, and how we do it as we move forward. I hope I've answered your questions, Mr. Gibbons.
But Secretary General, yeah, the question about the Caricom bubble and the coordinated approach to the pandemic, there's clearly a lot of unevenness in terms of the application of pandemic measures across the region. There's also a vexing question of the vaccine types. For example, Guyana's Sputnik is not recognized by a majority of CARICOM countries for entry of their nationals. So I wanted to get your impressions on that.
The CARICOM bubble, that was attempted early o'clock, but the reality was that there were different infection patterns, different kinds of impacts that we were seeing across member states, and even within member states. And so that the capacity for us to have one single way of treating with travel across the community or into the community faded early, because the demands in different places in the community turned out to be different. And it continues to vary. In some countries, we have much higher infection rates than others. In some, we have greater acceptance of vaccines than others. In some, we have greater delivery of vaccines than others. And so taking the changes into account, we really had to have member states be very careful about the policies that would protect their citizens and their economies. And so it's not unusual, and I don't find it a matter of it being too unusual because of the differences. Even within countries like the US, you had lots of different regimes all over, and it's really because of the nature of the pandemic. The other part of the question was in terms of the vaccines and the nature of the, again, the reality was that we were not dealing on a level playing field. That's the truth. Internationally, there's a lot of discussion that we've heard about the fact that the major industrial countries bought up a lot of the vaccines even before they were manufactured. And so for many of us in the region and in other parts of the world, countries took what they could get because the first line was to provide some degree of protection for their citizens. The reality is that as long as a vaccine, as far as countries were concerned, received the levels of approval that internationally would be given by a WHO, countries felt that they ought to be able to pull on those. And there's a process that those vaccines go through, the emergency approval and then the actual approval and all of that. And so countries did what they had to do. If you were not able to get one of the preferred vaccines, which would have been the ones it would seem that come out of the US, then you had to purchase and deliver what you could have access to, because the vaccines were not made available on an equitable basis globally.
Hi, good morning. Jeremy Abel, Open Interactive SKN Vibes Syndicate. I want to ask two questions first up. Going back to the question of unification and the vaccine, do you think, SG, good morning, that, and it's coming from a perspective where we found the vaccine and access to vaccine very challenging. Do you think that our approach in terms of one country, another country, and then we had the Caricom chairman at the time approaching the various agencies, territories, countries around the world to get vaccine, rather than we showing a collective approach as Caricom to engage with the various countries? That lack of cohesion among Caricom member states is actually affecting us on the international scene, whether or not it be vaccine, access to vaccines, or rather the issue of blacklisting or any other of those topical issues of the day. It's affecting us.
Can I try to answer that one? Can I try to answer that one before you go to the second one? Because I will tell you that the process of accessing vaccines for member states of Caricom has been one of the most coordinated, organized. I don't like to use the word unified, because unified would mean that we have a singular way of doing it. When we needed to access vaccines, countries that needed to access vaccines or had a way of got in on the basis that when they got some, they would share. And so we had countries get vaccines before others. Barbados, for example, got some vaccines, and as they got it, they shared some with the other countries. We had several countries do that. The reality was, as I say, across the globe, there was an inequality and uneven access to the available vaccines. And so countries who are able, who import, all countries have systems for importing their medications, and they did so, try to work through those systems. The negotiation with the US government was one that we did on a regional basis for a regional donation that we then continue to monitor on a regional basis, but there is no singular system that any country would have, much less a set of countries for accessing vaccines, given the range of producers and the range of possibilities that are there. But I will tell you, in my experience, the accessing vaccines for the community has been one of the most coordinated across the region. Even where individual countries were able to access for themselves, it was access for themselves with an understanding that they could and would share with the rest of the region where necessary. There's also don't forget, there's also the regional approach via the African Medical Supplies Platform, which we did on a regional basis. And we were able to access for those countries that wish to access through that platform. And we had most countries doing so. We were able to access as a group vaccines through the African Medical Platform. So the search for what is it, the word you use, unification? There isn't a unification, there's a harmonization and a collaboration that was there that resulted in us being able to get vaccines. Not enough, but we got more than some other places. That's the reality.
Well, it actually goes into my next question, which was, do you think, because based on what you're saying, SG, that when we approach, especially the African body to get vaccines, we approach as Caricom. But on a broader sense, it seems as though our access to vaccines, I know you went at pains to explain that, but when we look at all the issues affecting Caricom, like blacklisting and all these other issues, do you think that because one country, and even specifically with the reopening of borders and our approach to COVID, that we were not unified, we were not coming together as one in terms of our approach to dealing with certain issues, and COVID, for example, was a major one. Do you think when we approach international agencies, whether it be for funding or other topical issues, that because we do not have I don't want to say unified again, but we don't come as Caricom, it's affecting our approach to dealing and solving issues that are really affecting Caricom and maybe one territory or Caricom in general?
I think we need to recognize where we are. We are not a single country. We are 15 separate countries. And we work together on issues that we identify together as the #1 priority. And the #1 priority for the last year was the COVID pandemic, continues to be the COVID pandemic, and we continue to work together. We may not have a unified practice, but there is a single policy, and that single policy in every member state is to protect the citizens, to access as much vaccines as every country can get, to encourage citizens to get vaccinated. That policy remains the same in all our countries. But where you see the differences arise is where you have differences in the infection patterns, in the behaviors, and so policies do have to be customized to country, and each country has a responsibility to look after its citizens. As regards the other issues you raise, that you will not find again a unified approach. You will find an approach of increasing harmony as we deal with issues of blacklisting, of access to financing on the climate facilities is getting increasing harmonization as well because of the priority that is accorded to that in the region. But if you're looking for unity, then you're looking for one president, one prime minister, one minister of foreign affairs. You're looking, but that's not where we are. We're at coordination as best we can across a community of independent states.
You are back for a second round. Welcome again.
Yes, and I'm stuck on the pandemic issue. The OECS authority sought out and received independent legal advice on the question of vaccine mandates. Has the Caricom Secretariat been similarly approached? And if not, has the Secretariat considered research of its own on the question of the legal basis for vaccine mandates in the Caricom countries?
We follow very closely, and we received the legal advice that was procured by the OECS Secretariat. We don't feel that if we were to procure separate advice that it would be substantially different. One of the realities of our organization, as well as that as independent member states, we also have to look at what each country's laws provide for. And within each member state, there is a very deep discussion about the extent to which governments can implement vaccine mandates. That's even if we were to, at the level of Caricom, for argument's sake, say that the right thing to do is to implement a vaccine mandate in every single country. The way that would need to be implemented is through each individual country's legal system. And therefore, the countries at the national level have to sort through what's most appropriate, what's legally possible, what's doable for each of them. It's not something that could be implemented at all from a secretariat point of view, or even from a community decision point of view. It would have to work through the national legal systems of each country.
Hi, good morning. Nisha Paul, the New Today newspaper in Grenada. My question was in relation to the vaccine mandates, but I think the SG would have covered the questions I would have had. But just one follow-up in terms of what countries are allowed to do individually in terms of the vaccine mandates. Are considerations being given to the impact that it is having, the vaccine mandates that is having on the livelihoods of those individuals who do not wish to take the vaccine, or who choose to exercise what is called their constitutional rights to not take the vaccine? Are considerations, or would considerations be given? My question. Thank you.
I can't speak on behalf of any member state in that regard. I do know that the discussions are very energetic, and the issues that have crossed my desk and that I have heard being talked about on the issue of constitutional rights, for example, yes, you have a constitutional right to not take a vaccine if that's what you don't want to do, but the other members of society have a constitutional right to be protected from infections and that sort of thing. So we have to be very cognizant of where rights and responsibilities cross one another. There is no right that I am aware of that does not have some kind of expectation around how that right is exercised, whether it's a right to free speech, right to, however, there are limits around what you can say. For example, what you can print in your newspapers. So, all rights are circumscribed by responsibilities, and therefore, as a society, the governments have a responsibility to ensure an acceptable level of protection. And so if you want to exercise your right, and this is what's been said to me, if you want to exercise your right to not be vaccinated, then you would have to accept the responsibility to be tested, that as you move around, you are not infected and therefore spreading the infection, so that other people who have a right to have their health protected are not compromised. So I think as societies, we have to be more open to everyone being able to exercise their rights within reason, because as a society we have to exist, and I don't know that any right will supersede every other right. But then I'm not the lawyer, right?